Good afternoon. We have had an incredible 2 days, but it's not over yet. I have the honor of introducing to you our closing speakers for today's lunch. First, Michelle Bernard is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Bernard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy. She is also an MSNBC political analyst. In addition to being a regular panelist on numerous network and cable news shows, she is the author of Women's Progress: How Women Are Wealthier, Healthier, and More Independent Than Ever Before. An attorney by training, Michelle is passionate about public education reform. Our next speaker is the former mayor of the District of Columbia, my hometown, Adrian Fenty. As mayor, he made education a top priority and hired Michelle Rhee to take the DC public schools from the last in the nation to the district leading the pack in education reform. His drive to dramatically improve schools resulted in policies and practices that will provide Washington students with a quality education for years to come. From the other side of the country, and my new hometown, I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Antonio Villaraigosa. He has served as mayor in Los Angeles since 2005. He dedicated much of his first term to reforming Los Angeles public schools. His politics reflect his belief that in order to succeed as a great global city, Los Angeles must provide every child with a world-class education. Mayor Villaraigosa now oversees the Partnership for LA Schools, which is turning around some of the city's lowest performing schools. I'd also like to introduce, for our national perspective, Cesar Conde. He serves as a member of the board of directors for the Foundation for Excellence in Education. Cesar is also the president of Univision Networks at Univision Communications, Inc. In 2010, Univision launched an initiative called En Ese Momento. Now is the time. It's an initiative that focuses on raising graduation rates in high school and in college for the Latino community. And next week, for the first time ever, will be Education Week for the Hispanic community in America. Finally, someone who needs no introduction, our leader for this conference, Governor Jeb Bush. Let's give our panel a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are absolutely thrilled to be here today. As you know, we are going to be talking about closing the American Achievement Gap. Mayor Villaraigosa, I'm not getting it properly, but I'll get it. Villaraigosa. I'm going to say 4 words, and I want you to tell me what's the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Poverty is not destiny.
Education.
And LA, and California, and the entire United States.
I think in the world. I mean, poverty is related to lack of education. And for me, I look at my own life. When kids ask me how I got to be the mayor, the first from my community in 133 years, I say, oh, that's simple. I can read and write. I was a high school dropout, by the way, pushed out in many respects because I went to a school that was a dropout factory. About 75% of the kids dropped out. And I'm absolutely committed to education because I see what an education has done for me and what it could do for all of us.
Thank you, thank you. Mayor Fenty, leadership. Leadership in the face of very difficult odds. What can you tell the people that are joining us today about leadership in education reform and the kind of leadership that really moves and makes a huge difference in the lives of American children?
Oh, thank you. And Governor, thanks for having all of us here. I'll pick up where Joe left off this morning in that in order to really fix a school system, particularly an urban school system, you literally do have to be willing to kind of put everything on the line. Once you kind of start thinking about the election itself and getting reelected, if you prioritize that over the decision making, then you'll never make the tough decisions that need to be made to fix the school system and get at some of the outcomes that everybody in this room want to see. Again, everybody runs on the premise that they're going to, once they get elected, they're going to do the right thing, but political expediency seeps in, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes consciously, in a very ugly way.
Given what happened in the District of Columbia, well, first of all of us thank you for everything that you did, particularly for those of us that live in the Washington metropolitan area. We thank you for your hard work. We thank you for introducing the nation at large to Michelle Rhee.
Sure.
And the importance of equal educational opportunities for all children. That being said, any regrets?
Certainly not. The panel this morning of the 7 or so state superintendents was amazing, because not just because what they stand for, and I agree with almost all of them, and how hard they charge, but what's amazing is how new they are. Because in order to kind of win a movement like an education reform movement, you've got to have people go out front. And people like Chris Surf and Kevin and others who are now taking the helm of these states and making tough decisions, I think they're kind of following what we were doing in D.C., and we follow what Joel and Bloomberg did in New York, and they, of course, were right alongside the governor. So it's a pattern and a culture. The only one thing I would add, because I like to be honest and don't mind being controversial sometimes, is we do have to be honest about one fact. D.C. is a largely Democratic town, and one of the reasons that I got so much pushback and Michelle got so much pushback is because people in D.C. Subscribe to very left-wing policies around education. We do have to be honest that right now, at least in my opinion as a Democrat, Democrats have a long way to go in kind of getting past teachers' unions, special interest groups who are fighting real education reform. And I think it's the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party, and I'm going to keep from the inside trying to get Democrats to be a lot more progressive on the issue.
Thank you. You raise, I think you raise a very important point, and I want to raise this question to the entire panel, but particularly to our two big Democrats, and I say Democrats with a big D, as we were referring to you, both of you earlier today. There are many of us who believe that the whole question of equal educational opportunities should know no boundaries in terms of race, no boundaries in terms of ethnicity, and no boundaries in terms of political parties. And so that being said, how do we get, as a movement, more Democrats involved in meaningful education reform policies?
Well,
and Mayor, I'll go to you first.
First of all, I clapped because on Mayor Fenty's last statement, because I agree that there are many Democrats that are unwilling to challenge a broken system, particularly in our urban schools, unwilling to really address the achievement gap or take on the status quo. But on the right, there's also a focus on just reform and not the money that goes with it. In this state, we're 47th in per pupil spending. We've got to acknowledge that. When we had the best public schools in the nation, we were in the top 5 in per pupil spendings. Like Governor Bush, I believe, though, that if we're going to put more money in our public schools, we got to tie it to outcomes. We got to tie it to performance. We got to focus on the achievement gap, because in California, as an example, by 2025, we'll be 1 million down in the number of college graduates that we need. The biggest reason for that is the achievement gap. In LA, as an example, 86% of the kids are Latino or African American. A third are English language learners, and 10% African American. That's where the biggest challenge for our school district is. So I think there are Democrats and Republicans who frankly don't get it, and there are Democrats and Republicans who do. What I would say is, and I'll add a little controversy here, I am pro-union. I worked for the teachers union for 8 years. There's no union animus in me. But I do think that the most powerful defenders of the broken system are the teachers unions. And what I don't understand is, and what I've said to them is, we want to put teachers and parents in front of our movement. We want to put them We want to set a higher bar for the profession and a higher bar for our kids. And I believe we should pay our teachers more, but we should also expect more. And unfortunately, what we have is a system where we're focused a lot on rights and not on responsibilities and results.
Okay, thank you. Governor Bush, I want to ask you about Florida, but particularly not just the fantastic results that we've seen in Florida, I think in large part due to your leadership, but also to answer the question that Mayor Fenty, the statement that Mayor Fenty brought up earlier. How are you able to sort of engage in coalition building and bring more Democrats into the fold when you were governor of Florida? I've got a quote from you that I just absolutely love when you talk about winning the educational arms race. And I don't think you could have done that in Florida without bipartisanship in that state.
Well, at first there wasn't much bipartisanship. It was earned by results. I think the best reforms are the ones that yield the best results, and the best results sustain the reforms. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you fail, then people move on to the next thing. If you succeed and you highlight those successes, it allows you the next iteration of reforms to take place. I think the mayors have an interesting perspective on this challenge nationally, and I would, and the Mayor, you're being a little respectful about Republicans. I think there is an anti-reform coalition that is both left and right now, and there's a pro-reform coalition that is left and right, and it's actually an exciting time if we win this conversation nationally, where partisanship and ideology will be less relevant than moving to a student-centered kind of system. So if you listen to the mayors talk about what their suggestions for improvement are, I'm going to be nodding my head on all of it. And yet I've heard Republicans talk about things about how you improve conditions, and they don't get even to first base as it relates to creating the conditions for rising student achievement, which should be the only measurement that matters. So we're in this really interesting time. This is one of the only policy areas where there isn't just a gigantic food fight based on if you got an R or a D by your name. Yeah. And I kind of love being here rather than on the other side of the political world where, you know, the sun's up and a Democrat will say, no, the Republican says the sun's up, that's the moon, and vice versa. Yeah. That is so dangerous for our country. This is one place where if we win, we can really prove that you can find common ground. It doesn't matter what your political affiliation is, and so I hope that becomes a...
Absolutely, absolutely. Cesar, when we talk about closing the achievement gap and the promise that all of America's children can reach, a lot of times we forget to have discussions about bringing in terms of coalition building, the people who we're trying to really work with. And I wanted to ask you about your outreach efforts and your opinions on, for example, getting more Hispanic and African American parents and low-income parents of any race, religion, or ethnicity involved in the movement to close the achievement gap and to preserve educational opportunity for kids across the country.
Yeah. Well, look, one of the lenses we always look at this, certainly from Univision and the private sector in general, since we work in our particular case so closely with Hispanic and minority communities, you know, because so much of the demographic growth that's coming from here in the country is being driven by these groups. You know, I always like to point out this is just not a Hispanic issue or minority issue we're working on. This is an American issue. And that's something that we take very seriously. As far as bringing in parents, that is one of the fundamental focuses of our efforts. What we have found, particularly in minority families and in minority communities, is that there is a disconnect sometimes as to what is the actual economic impact that graduating from college can have for some of these students. And so one of the things that we constantly focus on is, you know, a young person or a student graduating from college doesn't just change the economic trajectory for that individual, but actually impacts the entire family and can have a ripple effect. And we think that's important. I think the second thing that we focus a lot on is there's tremendous work that is already being done by our governments, our schools, and many great community organizations. We in the private sector are not experts in education, but what we are experts in is communicating and shining a light on the existing resources that occur and so that exist. And so how we can get parents to understand that they have to be intimately involved with the education of their students, and then empower them with the right resources and tools that already exist, we think that's a place, that's a void that we can help fill in this entire initiative, this entire movement.
Mayor Fenty, what kind of things, policies or practices did you engage in when you were mayor of the district to get more parents involved and frankly, actually explaining to the greatest extent possible what we mean when we say that there is an achievement gap?
Yeah. So
There you go.
So here's a wild example of just how bad DC was when we took over. DC, when we took over, had the lowest performing African Americans in the country. So the African American students in DC compared to any other jurisdiction tested the lowest. And the white students in Washington, DC were number one compared with all the white students in the entire country. Wow. So we had, by definition, the largest achievement gap, not only that you had, but that you could have. And what we know is the case is that just over time, the schools in minority communities had just been neglected. And the reason was because people are unwilling to make tough decisions. And so what Michelle did when she came in was she closed and consolidated schools. She let go of half the central administration. She began to negotiate the very tough collective bargaining agreement with the support of a lot of funders who are here that tied outcomes to better pay. And all of that then helped to raise test scores. We led the nation in 4th and 8th grade test score increases on NAEP. Test scores went up about 15 percentage points on average. Our graduation rates went up, dropout rates went up, just because we were making some decisions that people who were in charge of the school system before, even though they knew they were supposed to make them, they were the right things to do, avoided because they were politically unpopular. So those things, those tough decisions that you hear about do lead directly to improve student outcomes. They also lead to better business outcomes as well. Michelle and her team were one of the first to use wireless generation, one of the first to use SchoolNet. When we renovated schools, we put $200 million a year into schools, all kinds of companies were now able to invest in the schools. Promethean boards, we put Promethean boards in every classroom of every new school that we built. So having someone who's kind of a hard charger and creative and private sector minded, I think is great for education. It's also great for opening up this huge flow of business and business opportunities to the private sector.
Thank you. Governor Bush, and actually to the entire panel, but Governor Bush, I want to start with you because you've done such a great job in tying performance to outcomes in the state of Florida. One of the criticisms that we hear quite often, or you read about from many people when we talk about closing the achievement gap, and I'll use DC as an example since that's my hometown also. We will hear, well, the achievement gap, for example, really hasn't closed that much. You know, in 3 years, it only closed 15%. Now, from the perspective of a parent or a student, I would say that closing the achievement gap in that short a period of time is a good thing. But how do you measure? What's an effective way to measure whether or not you're actually closing the achievement gap and doing what you've set forth to do?
Well, you test it, you measure it, and you're transparent about it, and you let the world know about it, and you accept when there's improvements, and if there's not, you adjust. This is a long-term struggle. So I would say that, for example, the mayor of Los Angeles has got a lot of things going on. It's a pretty complex city. I mean, we watch from afar and say, oh my God, can you believe what just happened in Los Angeles? A lot of stuff, good and bad, happens. And here's a guy who's he's in control of a select number of schools, but continues to be involved in this. He doesn't have to be. And that's what I would call essential in leadership. It's dogged determination, and it's got to be done over the long haul. We live in a world of immediate gratification. So if you get, say, you have one good year of test results, and you say, okay, it's done, let's check that off, and now we're going to go fight crime. You're going to find atrophy sets in immediately, and all the bad habits will kick in. You have to put constant pressure on a system that won't change by itself organically, and that requires public leadership that is it starts with dogged determination, never give in. And so I admire these leaders because one paid the price politically for doing what was right and made a great, contribution to education, not just in Washington, but around the country. And the other is continuing to fight when he doesn't have to make a difference for the children of Los Angeles. And that's what we need. That's what we need.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I want to speak to the issue. Thank you, Governor Bush. I want to speak to the issue of parent involvement. I mean, one of the things that we saw early on, and I tried to get mayoral control. I went to the legislature. I used to be Speaker of the Assembly. I have a little influence there still. We were successful in getting a mayoral partnership with the school district. The district sued. We lost at the trial court and on appeal. I then raised about $7 million or so in the most expensive school board races in U.S. history to elect a board that was focused on reform and that wanted to partner with the mayor. So 6 years ago when I became mayor, about 33% of the schools were on the API, which is the Academic Performance Index, 33% were below 650. Today, only 10% are below 650. We've doubled the number of schools that are at 800. And we've doubled the number of charters, and we have some of the most successful charters in the country in our school district. I've taken over 22 schools, 18,000 kids. I took on the lowest performing schools, the most violent schools. I was sharing with the governor that I took on a school where Markham Middle School in Watts, where 122 kids were arrested on campus the year before. On campus. The first year I took over, it was less than 20. The second year, it was less than 10. This last year, it was about 3. It's had a 50... I think about a 56-point increase in the API over the last 3 years. Another school, 99th Street School in Watts, 100-point increase. So one of the things that I think the governor's talked about is that we believe in setting the highest expectations for these kids. I told you I went to a school that was a dropout factory. I was pushed out, went from college prep Catholic school to upholstery classes and basic English classes because that was the era. And we set high standards for our kids. We focus on data. We look at where, the problems are, where the basic, the proficient, and the advanced students are, and we focus our resources there. We're focusing on creating more effective teachers. And every one of our schools has a parent center with a administrator focused on parent engagement. Because we believe that if this is just about politicians driving this and it's not parent and teacher driven, it won't last over time. And then finally, we've organized a parent union because, as I said, I'm not against unions, I'm for them, but I think parents and students ought to have one too. And we pushed the parent trigger in California, which many of you now know going around the country, where parents can engage and choose an operator when schools are failing. We have 100 schools on a thing called, of the 780, on a thing called public school choice, where every failing school and every new school has to compete for an operator. It could be a charter, it could be a union teacher collaborative, it could be my partnership schools, but it's got to be focused on metrics-driven plan that says this is what we're going to do over a period of time to improve our schools. Now, as I said, we're also not funding our schools, and I don't want to leave anybody with the impression. My daughter went to Marlboro, the best girls' school in LA, at the tune of $26,000 a year. We're not funding our schools in California anywhere close to that. I think it's somewhere with federal money, somewhere about $8,000 or so. So we've got to do a lot more to fund our schools, but we also have to do a lot more to reform our schools, and that's why I wanted to be here with the governor, with Adrian and all of you, because I think it is important that we create a broad coalition of people that understand what I said earlier, and that is, this is the economic issue of our time, it's the democracy issue of our time, and it's the civil rights issue of our time. And if we're going to compete in the world, we've got to lift the standards of excellence in our schools and expect a lot more from our adults.
Thank you, thank you. We're gonna wrap up in a minute. What I'm gonna do is ask each one of our panelists Just to speak a little bit on something I think that you mentioned earlier, which is very, very important, and we don't hear enough about it. We've heard so many complaints from people that in order to meet the goals, for example, of No Child Left Behind and a lot of other areas, that we actually need to lower our standards. And I think it's very important for the audience to hear from everybody here in a leadership position the reason why lowering standards is absolutely wrong. And when we are talking about the least among us, there's absolutely no reason that we don't have set the highest expectations possible for our students, for our parents, for our teachers. And Cesar, if we could just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, from a private sector perspective, that's how we run our business. We set extraordinarily high standards and high thresholds, and then we constantly measure. And one of the things that we're constantly focusing on when we speak to our community is ensure that they understand that the secret to success here in this country is to be able to not only graduate from high school, because there is a sentiment in our community that is an accomplishment, and we are trying to change that from a cultural perspective, that the highest focus that a young member can have in our communities is to graduate from a college level degree. And it is a cultural fundamental change that some urban families and some urban communities have to go through, but it's fundamental to change that.
Okay.
I'll answer it very simply. In a school district, LA, where 50% of the schools were failing, how can we lower our standards any lower than that?
Good answer.
Good answer, Governor.
I believe in benchmarking to the world. If we want to be the world's greatest country, which I believe we are, and want to sustain that, we should benchmark ourselves to the world and pay the price if we don't achieve it, and do something different to make sure that more and more of our students do. So I'm all in on Common Core standards, not because they're necessary because they're common, although there's some advantages there. I do think it's because they're benchmarked to the best in the world, and that's what we should aspire to.
That's right.
Thank you. Mayor Fenty.
Yeah, I thought that Melinda Gates gave a great talk and presentation on the Common Core last night, and glad to see that movement continuing. And at the local level, at the management level, what you want to see from your school superintendent or your mayor or your governor is that they approach running a school system as if they are dealing with their own kids. So that, and that was one thing Michelle and I were very big on at teacher orientation every year. She used to say, and this is how it should be, that if you weren't prepared as a teacher to come in and take all of the different problems that the kid has coming to school, all of the malnutrition and abuse that may be found in the home and the community, and still make sure that kid got an excellent education, and she used to literally say this, then maybe the District of Columbia public school system isn't for you. Because you've got to have the same standards for each and every one of the kids in your classroom that you have for your own kids.
That's it.
And I think there's more technical ways to say it, but I kind of like just saying it like that and having that high standard.
And that's why we like you so much. We're going to wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, how about a hand of applause for our panel?
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We got you out on time, Mayor.
Thank you.
So while Mayor Fenty, Mayor Villaraigosa, Cesar, Conde, Michelle, and Governor Bush are walking off stage, I truly want to thank them for coming and speaking and taking time out of their schedule. We're going to start wrapping up the summit, and so I have a couple of remarks for you, a couple of reminders for you. So we had, over the last day and a half, more than 750 attendees from 48 states, more than 250 lawmakers and policymakers. Our theme was Education Everywhere for All Children, and the name of our summit is called Excellence in Action. And so I want to talk about that word action. What we try to do every year with our summit is show you action, show you the policymakers that are making changes in their states. But what we want you to do is to leave here and take action in your own state. We want you to go back, take one thing, or as Tony Bennett and I think I said on other panels, do 10 things. If you do 10 things when you leave here, you're going to get 7. If you only try one, you may not get it at all. Be aggressive, push the envelope, and we want to see you all next year, next November in Washington, D.C., and see all the reforms that you have passed highlighted. Thank you so much for coming. Superintendent Tom Luna is going to come up and bless the meal. Thank you.